Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Guardbeardia. It is I, the Beldam, introducing yet another chapter to the Emily Bronze series, written by Guardbeardia, who is also here tonight. Evening, morning, whenever you're watching the video, really. I kind of feel like this is much fancier than I usually do these intros, but whatever. I'll leave Guardbeardia to do our sponsor because I don't know anything about it.
The Beldam broke her microphone holder, so she sounds like a sassy news person now, but I'll take it. So, our sponsors are two. There is Skull Taker Dice, where you can find all the click-clack math rocks you like, and multiple sets of metal, pewter, silver, and even regular old plastic. But they got all kinds of dice sets for you to go and see and buy, and I have my own. I actually have two dice sets from them now. Both of them brass, because I like the way they sound when they hit the table. And then there's Redcon 1. Redcon 1 is where you can go to find all your supplement and meal replacement needs. Now, I, for one, are mostly cycling in on the MRE series due to the fact that it's food that's good for you. I also am taking out this creamsicle pre-workout stuff that's it's pretty juicy. But since I've started using Redcon 1, I'm getting my mass back. It's quite nice because I wasn't eating enough, you see. I get to work in, I get to write, and I wouldn't cook food. I was too busy. And, you know, when you do that, it leads to bad eating habits. So I had to go and find something to replace food I wasn't eating. And Redcon 1 MRE powder and bars are the food you need, and I'm actually getting my gains back, and it feels pretty good. It comes in all kinds of flavors. You get MRE Full, MRE Light. You get the bars for breakfast and MRE bars for meals or snacks in between. And it gets all the proteins and most of the vitamins and minerals you need. And I would highly recommend that if you live a life where time is short and you're tired and you just need to eat something quick without too much fuss, this is the way you gotta go, because it'll get you the food you need. Additionally, I'm now a Tier 4 operator, and if I get around 40 more orders, I'm now a Tier 3 operator, and I get commissions. But the thing is, you don't have to spend big. Just get the things you need and the things you want, and go from there. Just this last week, I ordered the chocolate chip oatmeal MRE bars and the Dutch apple pie MRE powder, and they're pretty dang good. They are awesome with milk, and they're good for mornings, and yeah, I'm getting the food I need. So, you know, I'm using it, I trust it, I think you guys can trust it too, and use it to get the protein and the nutrients you need, so that way we can all make it. Redcon 1, it's food.
Chapter 8, Griddled and Pan-Fried. Sweat was pouring down Emily's forehead as she blinked across the desk at Ogledock, whose own eyes were so narrow that she only knew they were even open because of the glowing colors underneath. Jomacia had been right. She had seen Ogledock angry and annoyed before, but his hair, skin, and eyes were glowing with the volcanic colors of a bonfire, rippling in waves along his skin and hair in time with his breath. Worst part was, they hadn't said anything since she had sat down, and had been staring at each other for almost 5 minutes now. Every now and again, Ogledock would tap his fingertips together as if contemplating speaking, but then ball them back into fists as he fought for the right words to use. As a matter of fact, the only one to have said anything at all was the Torque, talking directly into Emily's mind after 6 minutes had passed.
He seems nice.
Shut up, you idiot!
Emily hissed at him, and she could feel the cheeky smile permeating her brain. Beside Ogledock's desk was the stack of loot she had gathered from the campsite, none of it disturbed since she had set it on the tile and sat down in the chair she was currently in.
Well, all I'm saying is that he clearly has a lot of passion in him. I can feel that from all the way over here on your neck.
That's rage, not passion. I can say very certainly that he is not feeling passionate about me in a good way.
Passion can go both ways.
Emily's eye twitched as she fought back her own passions and swept her mind free when Ogledock finally opened his eyes fully, leaning back off his desk and resting his hands on the top of it. What did it do? Emily opened her mouth and made a noise. Could he hear the damn thing talking to her? There was no way, right? What do? Bright new annoyance coursed up and down Ogledock, and she could see him fighting the urge to bite out his words.
The necklace, Emily. What did it do to make you wear it?
Phew, he's not a mind reader. she thought, and straightened up slightly, lightly tapping her left boot tip on the ground quietly.
It just, talk to me and stuff.
And stuff, Ogledock echoed darkly, and she saw his eyes come down to rest at the two ends of the torque, both of which were resting lightly on her clavicles. She had undone the top 2 buttons of her work shirt due to nerves and to get some fresh air during the flight, and the skin was exposed to the light of his office. What did it ask for?
Nosy little thing, isn't he?
The torque mused, and Emily mentally hissed at it again before speaking.
Well, you see, it just asked me to wear it is all. I didn't ask for anything in return, like blood or something.
She could feel a sudden unease in her stomach as Ogledock raised an eyebrow. So you just put on a magical piece of jewelry after it asks without anything desired in return, and you didn't ask any questions as to why its requests were so simple? Emily flushed red up her neck, and her lips drew back into a slight snarl.
Well, I didn't really have a lot of time to stop and ask it all the questions in the Magical Necklace for Dummies handbook. Morel was sitting in a puddle of goddamn blood. They just butchered a harpy to death in front of me. I wasn't really thinking straight at the time.
As she spoke, Emily leaned forward and slapped her palms on Ogledock's desk, the noise of which caused a ripple of color to flash across his eyes. Judging from the intensity of the colors, Emily judged it to perhaps have been a bad move on her part. Ogledock flicked his eyes from the torque to her own eyes, and it looked as if he was a living flame on the inside instead of meat and bone.
So it took advantage of you then?
It saw an opportunity to bind itself to a willing participant that would be pressed for an edge in a battle it knew you couldn't avoid. Emily froze, her lips still in a snarl, but the fight was steadily pulling away from her. She thought inwardly of the torque, a slight edge to her voice.
Is that true?
There was no answer, only a lingering silence as the torque went cold turkey on talking. She felt a cold rush through her veins. Should she have asked more questions? What did it mean that it only wanted to be worn? Why didn't it ask Morel to wear it, Emily? Ogledock asked, his voice flat and professional. Emily shifted her rump in her seat, her boot toe now more rapidly tapping on the ground.
It said it couldn't function with her.
Ogledock's colors muted slightly, and he cocked his head an inch to the left. What do you mean it couldn't function? What does it function off of then? Does it consume something?
Well, yeah, it said she had accepted death, and that it needed...
Emily drawled off to a silence as she remembered the words the torque had said to her, still as fresh in her mind as the harpy's fate.
Of course not. She had accepted she was going to die. I need rage to function, not an embracement of demise. Without the fire to survive, she was worthless to me.
Emily brought her voice back from where it had left off.
Needed rage to function, the fire to survive. She had accepted she was going to die, so it didn't want her. It wanted me instead.
That shows it has greed and desire, which puts it into the level 1 category of magical artifact, Ogledock said with a sigh, and the colors drained away from his body, the only motes of fire left dancing in his eyes as they stared at his hands. Level 1 magical artifacts are sentient, mysterious, and always have ulterior motives in mind. Do me a favor, Emily. Ogledock leveled his eyes on her and spoke in a dangerous tone, a tone that inflicted more than any number of words ever could. Take it off.
Take it off?
Emily asked, and Ogledock nodded, rubbing the thumbs and pointer fingers of his hands together with rasps of flesh. Take off the necklace. Emily squinted an eye and scoffed, her confidence coming back to her. Okay, fine. She reached up and grabbed the two ends of the torque and pulled against them, expecting the rear middle of the torque to be as soft as it had been when she had first put it on. But as she flexed her forearms to pull it apart, she felt it budge for a single instant, then freeze, and it all came to a sudden halt. Her heart skipped a single beat, and she looked up to Ogledock, whose shoulders raised slightly when he saw the torque halt the movement. Emily reshifted herself in her seat, gave her fingers a flex as her thumbs held onto the two ends of the torque, and she lurched her entire shoulder and arm muscles into a tug, her biceps and forearms flexing stiffly as she tried to wrench the two ends apart. The torque began to tremble as her arms began to shake, and now a panic was starting to grip Emily as she threw her entire body into it, her teeth bared and air hissing out through them as she sucked in a breath, The spear tip gouged in her hand, and a small trickle of blood began to wind its way down her forearm, while the bones of her palm were ground by the head of the horse on the other side.
"What are you playing at?"
she thought hotly as she continued to strain, and her arms began to shudder as she put more strength into it.
"Why aren't you coming off? Get off of me!"
As she continued to growl and wrench at the torque, a single word invaded her mind, and she felt the strength in her body erode as if it were a wave washing against a seaside cliff.
No.
"No? What in the hell do you mean, no?"
The voice was like iron as it came at her, and the little inch she had gotten it to spread ever so slowly began to close, then closed even further until the spear and the horse were almost touching, as if driving the point home.
That, Emily Bronze, was not a part of our deal.
The blood running down her forearm increased as the spear was dug deeper into her hand, until finally she relented, ripping both of her hands away from either end of the torque. She sat in the chair, panting, and fear began to fill her eyes as she stared down at her palms, one already bruising and the other bleeding profusely. The breaths coming into her lungs were rapid and shuddering as the sudden cold weight of what was going on began to dawn on Emily. While she had first thought the torque was some kind of friendly entity, it now became clear that it had an agenda and was not keen on being able to be removed without its own permission. Ogledok's eyes slowly closed as he came to the same conclusions Emily was being shouldered with, and a new greenish color began to ripple here and there along his body. Even the flickering colors of rage in his eyes became tinged with the color, and Ogledok stood up as the fear began to make its way through him. While Emily was looking down at her hands and shaking, her toe was rapidly tapping the ground as if she were a rabbit trying to signal for an intruder. Ogledok grabbed a small first aid kit, popped the latches on it, and reached out, his warm fingertips softly taking hold of Emily's wounded hand. He pulled over the other chair and sat catty-cornered to her front, wiping up and down her forearm with a cleaning pad and removing the long trails of blood that had been making its way down her skin. The sting of the alcohol pad on her hand caused Emily to jerk, and she looked up, her eyes wide and frightened. Emily's voice cracked as she spoke, and it wavered when he looked up into her eyes.
"Augie, how bad did I just fuck up?"
He continued to dab at her hand while he looked at her, before sighing and tossing the crimson-soaked pad into the trash. "I don't know. What all has it done?"
"It kept me alive,"
she said, and Emily swallowed thickly, and actually felt the torque relax on her neck, opening slightly as it had been before she had tried to pull it apart. "It kept me going after being shot and speared, closed up my wounds, helped Mariel eat when she couldn't." Ogledok ripped off the top of a new alcohol pad and flicked it towards his trash can, his deft fingers pulling out the cool towel inside and opening it. He was a little more kind about it now, dabbing around the wound in her hand. "Why isn't it healing this one, then?"
"I don't know,"
she murmured, and winced as the pad touched her wound again. Ogledok cleaned the wound and pulled out a small rod from the box, rolling it between his palms in order to warm it up. "I don't know either, Emily. These things are not an enchanted ring or a whistle that can call any dog you're looking at to command. They are things. Things with their own minds and their own voices. They think and act on their own accord. Right now, that thing is like a parrot on your shoulder, along for the ride." He nodded at the torque as he said this, then gave the rod a wiggle, light from within it flaring to life as he did. Ogledok touched the rod to the open, angry wound in her palm, and after a few minutes of the warm tip resting on it, the wound was gone and replaced with new, fresh pink skin. He held her hand with both of his hands, palms up under hers as he inspected the new skin, and Emily saw that the colors in his eyes and hair were cooling, and another color she knew of was playing out along his cheeks in its usual watercolor splotches. "I'm not mad at you, Emily," he finally said after some time of turning her hand this way and that. "I get it. You were in a tough spot due to Mariel and had to act fast. Seeing the harpy as you did probably did not help the matter. However, you have to be mindful about that thing around your neck. It's not a tool, it's your passenger, almost as if it's a parasite." Emily sniffed as she watched Ogledok look at her hand, and while she was thinking vitriolic things at the torque, she did want to make Ogledok feel a little less bad about what all was going on around her.
"Like the egg salad sandwich?"
Ogledok looked up, his eyebrows brought together and mouth agape slightly, canines just barely visible behind his lip. "The what now?"
"You know, the magical egg salad sandwich from the seedy gas station."
Ogledock squinted before realization came across his eyes and mouth evolved into a wide grin. "You don't mean from Parasite Lost, do you?" Emily began to giggle openly as Ogledock began to, now with a more friendly air, explain to her that this torque is nothing compared to a truck stop bathroom vending machine sandwich. After a few minutes of reciting quotes to each other and laughing, Emily felt better than she had in the moments after the torque refused to open, and both Emily and Ogledock realized that the entire time the changeling had been holding her hand, and Emily had never removed it. Upon the realization, Ogledock released her hand, and Emily brought it towards her center, flexing it and testing the new skin. Ogledock was more purple than usual, his face splotchy and flecked with color. He cleared his throat and got up from the seat catty-corner to Emily, moving around his desk and sitting down in his own chair on the other side. "Anyway, send in Marill, she's next on my yell-at list, and then when I'm done with her, I'll go through the bag and find out what's what. I'm gonna split it between you, Marill, and the company. Go ahead and get unpacked. You've had a week." Emily blew out a breath from pursed lips and tapped her boot toes on the floor. "I have had a week, that I will admit." She stood, brushed her now blood-stained shirt, grimaced, and turned to leave. Opening the door wide enough to slip through, she was halfway through the door when she heard Ogledock speak up and paused, her boots squeaking on the floor. "Emily?" She turned, eyebrows raised. "Yeah, Augie?" "Be careful," he said, and his eyes put power behind his words as he studied her. "Please." Emily swallowed again and nodded slightly, flexing the hand he had been holding but a few minutes ago. "I'll try, Augie. I'm sorry." "It's okay," he said quietly in answer, before he put a small teasing smile on his face. "Be sure to get a lawyer next time." Emily closed her eyes, tilted her head to the side as she fought for an answer to his jest, but instead she just pushed past the door, closing it softly behind her. She called for Marill, who was waiting in the entertainment area with her ears pinned back, and she blew a raspberry quietly before walking forward. "Be brave, faithful steed," Emily said reverently to Marill, which earned her a shove to the chest, sending her cackling over the back of a couch and tumbling into the cushions on the other side. "Little smartass, Ogledock's gonna tear me a new one," growled, and she opened the door to the office, out of which came the Ogledock that had greeted Emily when she opened the door. "Where the hell is the gun I bought you? I'm taking that shit out of your pay, horse brain!" Marill pushed past the door and closed it hurriedly behind her, but Emily caught her retort before the door could fully shut out the noise within the office. "Look, I can explain. Things went a little pear-shaped in Oklahoma, all right?" While Marill was getting done in by Ogledock, Emily had taken her new lever action to get looked at by Jamesha, who was still hanging out in the vehicle depot near his beloved monobike. He was fussing over the composition of the ammunition while Emily was sitting on a toolbox and looking down at the concrete, her boot tips silent as she concentrating on the feeling of the torque, the metal cool on the skin of her neck. As Jamesha was busy figuring out what the powder and accelerant were made out of, she had been nagging at the torque mentally, pounding it constantly with questions at such speed she would be a math genius if she harnessed the energy into something besides screaming, "Talk to me." The torque broke before Emily did, and had lasted until Jamesha had begun reverse engineering the compounds. The torque sounded aggravated, but more in the way that a person would be aggravated with having to face a problem they were hoping would never come to light.
Yes.
"What the fuck is up with you? I tried to take you off and you stabbed into my hand like an asshole."
She felt the torque actually look skyward in exasperation.
Naturally. You would have never put me back on after what the walking mood ring had said.
Emily narrowed her eyes at the comment and set her feet solidly, leaning down on her knees with her elbows.
"How do you know what a mood ring is?"
What do you mean? Everyone knows what a mood ring is.
The torque answered, wavering a bit in her mind, having found itself having said too much.
"You said you were buried with Boudica. How the hell would you know what a mood ring is?"
One of the fish people were talking about them.
"Really? A cultist was just randomly discussing mood rings and you learned all about them, did you?"
Of course. He was very descriptive of what it was and what they do.
Emily pursed up her lips in contempt, squinting her eyes.
"That's as believable as a duck learning how to figure skate. You tricked me, didn't you? You did exactly what Ogledock said. You took advantage of me."
Emily stood abruptly in anger, causing Jamesha to pause in his work, his synthesis kit sprawled across an entire workbench.
Emily, are you okay?
I'm fine.
Emily called back shortly, but Jamesha was rather ill-eased by how she bared her teeth and began to glare at the side of the large APC that sat parked nearby.
You saw me as easy prey, easy for the picking, and latched onto me like some kind of fucking tick. What's next, huh? Gonna take over my brain here soon? Turn me into some kind of zombie that obeys your only whim?
The Torque was silent for a while, but spoke up after Emily gave a chuff, thinking she had won the mental duel.
No. Frankly, that sounds like a lot of work.
It was quiet as Emily snorted derisively, pacing around the toolbox she had been sitting on. Jamesha watched warily, wondering if she was going to go berserk or something.
But it may be true that I took advantage of the situation. Well, no, I did. I did take advantage of your desperation.
I knew it, you little piece of...
Muriel gave me the idea.
Emily skidded to a halt on the flats of her boots and turned around, facing Jamesha with a face of shock. Jamesha looked over towards where his own pistol and rifle lay, nervous of just how far away they were.
Don't look at me like that. I'm doing the best I can over here. This powder is strange and complicated.
Emily waved her hands at Jamesha, making a shushing noise.
Hush up, I ain't talking to you.
She then spun on her heel and continued pacing around the toolbox, and Jamesha didn't know whether to be relieved or to start extending his arm joints towards his pistol. He had read a lot of this plain science fiction books, and it appeared this brand of humans tended to explode into parasites or evolve into giant walking demons. Fiction he knew it was, but these were odd times.
What do you mean Muriel gave you the idea?
I had probed her first in my own desperation. The harpy was too far gone in the head with fear to get a grasp on him, but with Muriel, she had a spark deep down inside that I was able to use in order to see into her memories for a few days. I saw you, saw what she thought of you, and decided to hedge my bets on you coming to save her. She was not, as I had told you before, sold on the idea, but I held out hope when she did not.
Emily stopped pacing and folded her arms onto her chest, staring out into the main axis drive through the vehicle depot.
What does she think of me then?
The Torque gave a cough.
Let's not get into that right now. She held faith that you alone could take all of the cultists down yourself, so I held the same belief. When you actually arrived, I waited until the time was right and made my gambit.
And the rest is history.
Emily breathed out as she thought it, still a bit angry about the whole thing since she was more or less taken advantage of in an extremely stressful situation.
Come on now, I kept you and your friend alive, didn't I? Besides, we made our terms. All you have to do is wear me.
Okay. Well, I don't want to wear you anymore, so let go of me.
Emily thought icily and began tapping her foot. The Torque did not answer, nor did it release its form from her neck, and anger began to crawl back up Emily's shoulders and veins.
I said, let go of me.
I don't want to.
Emily stamped down her boot and roared both mentally and physically, her voice echoing around the large metal building as she screamed.
This is my body too, you crooked little son of a bitch!
Jamesha startled and spun around on his own heels as he had turned to grab a caliper to measure the bullet, and a 7-inch steel spike had come out from his wrist, singing into the air with a ring of metal. Emily, however, was not looking at him, instead looking at the concrete again with angry, trembling shoulders. Angry, furious tears were stinging at her eyes due to the indignation of it all, the inability to get this thing off of her and having to instead wait for it to decide when it was done with her. She choked out a sob and wrapped her arms around her stomach, bending over lightly as she continued to make short, biting sounds of emotional turmoil, hurling every abuse she knew in her vocabulary at the thing that was resting on her clavicles. The feeling coming back from the Torque was mixed, something akin to shame with flavors of its own inner desperation.
Emily, come on now. It doesn't have to be like this. Let me help you. There may be a time where...
I want nothing from you! You were a mistake, and now I can't even get you off of me!
Emily snarled from within her mind, and she jerked back up to where she was now standing straight, rubbing at her eyes with the palms of her hands. She sniffed and turned, seeing that Jamesha was plastered against the wall with a long-ass metal spike poking out of his wrist. Jamesha's metallic skull head eyed her warily, and he wiggled the spike at her.
You're not going to start growing legs and crawling at me rapidly, are you?
Emily sniffed again and wiped at her cheeks with her forearm.
No, you big metal idiot. I'm not infected by the thing or something.
Jamesha relaxed slightly and retracted the spike back into his wrist with a raspy schlick of metal on metal, then took a moment to brush down the front of his clothes and pants. It was one of those weird things about Jamesha. Despite the fact he was metal all the way around on the outside, he still chose to wear clothes to try and keep from being too off-putting to those around him. While Emily sniffled angrily and cleaned her face, Jamesha cleared his throat robotically and went about his workbench, laying out the materials that comprised the 357 Ursa Penetrator.
Anywho, horror movie fit aside, I figured out what these cartridges are, and believe it or not, they're American.
Emily flapped her hands, shaking away the nerves that were still wriggling through her system.
American? That's impossible. They came from a spaceship, Jamesha.
Emily, I just...
Shut up, you little metal bastard. I'm done dealing with you for the day.
Yes, it's a bit strange because it also had the word Alliance on the end of it, but it definitely says American on it. Now, the bullet and powder are a bit special, as they use a very complicated accelerant that produces a lot of power. And the bullets are composed of multiple jackets of different materials. The good news is that I can easily reproduce these bullets to factory specifications.
Emily pulled out one of her own spare rounds from her belt and flipped it around in her hand, and sure enough the words American Alliance were engraved on it, along with the namesake of the round.
Please, let me explain myself.
Emily ignored the torque and spoke over it to Jamesha, her eyes set along with her face.
So how are you able to produce these? These are from a completely different plane of existence, more than likely.
Jamesha cocked his head slightly as he gazed at Emily.
Emily?
Yeah?
I am also from a different plane of existence. I'm pretty confident I can send out a request for the chemicals and get a response in less than half an hour.
Emily formed her lips into a line and nodded her head in a sardonic but acknowledging manner.
Right. You would think after what's happened I would have a better head for this kind of stuff.
I wouldn't feel too bad about it. It's easy to forget that you have hamburgers next to goblins and ethereal watchers.
Jamesha said quietly, and gently patted Emily on the top of her head.
Yeah, okay, big guy. Let's not layer on the smugness too much until I get this hoop off of my neck.
Jamesha looked down at the torque and studied it while Emily fixed her hair, and his eyes flickered as he scanned the metal with his sensors.
Seems to be ordinary gold, high quality and old for sure, but simple gold. Even a teenager could pull that necklace apart easily.
Yeah, well, most necklaces ain't got something living in it.
Emily huffed and pointed down at the bullets. Think you can make me some special ones too, besides the normal ones?
How special? I'm sure a little 53 Romeo thermite can make things a little more interesting and can really start a party if used right. Or end it.
Dealer's choice,
Emily said tiredly and hugged Jamesha from the side, patting him on his metallic shoulder. I appreciate it, Jamesha. Really.
Not a problem. When you finally burst open and turn into some kind of possessed monster, try to remember to give me a running start.
Emily scoffed and gave him a light smack with the back of her hand on his arm, but as she imagined, he probably felt little of it. When she walked out of the large metal garage building, she heard the throaty rumble of an inline-6 engine, and around the bend of the motor pool main drive came a Terang Suga, which sported multiple holes in the hood as well as a cracked windscreen. Tarj was leaning out the driver's side window and driving it to the best of his ability, while Yapuya was busily trying to ready a fire extinguisher. Emily wasn't sure why until the engine suddenly erupted into flames and Yapuya began hosing it with the extinguisher, emptying the entire thing into the engine compartment before tossing the empty can out and away from the wheels of the Suga.
Jamesha, quick! Grab your glowy engine thingy!
Jamesha came jogging out from behind Emily, and the cyborg looked as stricken and confused as Emily did, before giving a robotic sigh.
I lent it to them in perfect condition.
The Suga slammed to a halt a few feet away, the sound of a parking brake being hurriedly put into place cranked into the air, and both of the occupants dove away from the car, rolling onto the ground and sprinting away from it. Jamesha started forwards, eyes already glowing as he scanned the Suga, but he stopped and turned, looking away from the stricken vehicle.
Plug your ears.
What?
Emily screeched and was a few seconds too late as the engine of the Suga detonated with a boom, throwing rods and pieces of the engine into the air like a macabre confetti popper. Flaming pieces of debris soaked with ignited oil rained down on the group, Tarj and Yopuya howling as they ran for cover, while Emily sidestepped a header that was cartwheeling in her direction. Jamesha didn't move, but just clicked his teeth in annoyance when all the raining metal finally halted, and now before him was a burning collectible that was far beyond normal repair.
That Suga was vintage.
Emily heard Jamesha say with an angry sigh before pulling some kind of box out of his toolkit and throwing what looked like sugar dust onto the flames. The flames died down instantly and were replaced by hisses and pops from the engine compartment, while in the background, Yopuya threw her wings into the air happily.
Tarj, we made it back alive!
Taj looked up from the ground, having dove onto his stomach to avoid a lifter rod coming at him like a vengeful spear.
Yeah, with nothing to show for it.
What do you mean? We have the rucksack!
With this, Yopuya pulled out a small clear sandwich bag full of what looked like random shore pebbles, and the sight of them made Tarj lower his forehead back down to the ground.
The rocks.
He sobbed defeatedly and laid still on the ground while Yopuya pulled out a single stone and peered at it. Emily was wiggling a finger in her ear and wincing from the ringing in her skull as she walked towards the pair, her eyes plastered with confusion.
What the hell happened to you two?
Yopuya held up the stone in her wing claw.
We got treasure!
They're rocks, Yoipua. Rocks. You robbed a heavily armed kobold over his fucking rock collection.
Tarj bellowed into the ground, then rolled onto his back, finding himself looking up at Emily. He swallowed and swished his lips from side to side to reset his small half-orc tusks into their proper places, then continued to explain to Emily what had happened. Yopuya and Tarj had befriended a small local guide in Paradise Valley to help ease their access into the local loot scuttlebutt, hoping to make things go a bit quicker in the long run as neither of them were fond of Arizona.
Yoipua, being the charming one she is, asked to see his collection that he was always hissing about.
Tarj growled, while Yopuya chirruped happily and now had a small pile of rocks in her wing claws. Jamesha, meanwhile, was cursing angrily under his non-existent breath and had begun trying to see why the engine had chosen to explode.
When she saw the collection, she wanted it too because of a few common opals that were in it. We had barely gotten to the salt shores when Yoipua tried to make off with it and kicked the kobold off a cliff. This is where we both learned that not only did the kobold collect rocks, he also collected magical knuckle bones.
Tarj sat up and groaned, rubbing the tip of his left shoulder with his right hand.
Little lizard bastard stopped his fall, came back up the cliffside, summoned a mechanical spider that had a machine gun on top of it, and it chased us until it ran out of juice and died on the side of the road some states away. We couldn't even sleep or even piss standing still for days until it ran out of power.
Emily assumed Jamesha had found what Tarj was hinting to when she heard a roar of mechanical fury from over by the Suga.
Who peed all over the damn floorboards?
I did!
Yopuya called out happily, then bundled all her rocks back into the sandwich bag before legging it for the company building. From below, Tarj groaned with inherent unhappiness, and Emily helped him to his feet.
Well, don't worry too much. I got pretty lucky down in Vegas. I should have plenty to spare.
Tarj flexed his jaw but hung his head, leaning slightly on Emily.
Thanks, Ems. I was hoping to send a bit back home to help pay for a new roof. Rackaron's been having bad Anderthals this year.
Anderthals? Emily asked, patting him on the ribs with the arm that was wrapped around his waist and supporting him.
Sorry. You guys call them mongooses, I believe.
Emily chuckled.
Monsoons. I gotcha. Come on, let's get you inside. I'll make you a latte.
Can you draw something in it?
Sure, big guy. Whatever you want.
Tarj gave a sniff.
Thanks. It's been a week.
Emily blew out a breath as the torque jostled on her neck from Tarj's movements.
You don't even know the half of it, Orc Man.
When they had both made it inside, Emily deposited a very tired and slightly singed Targe on the couch, then bustled about with the espresso machine to make the half-orc something warm and comforting. As she swished the milk around on the steamer stem, Yopuya made an appearance, but a single look from Emily made her scuttle back to her room, her avian talons clicking rapidly on the tile floor. She chose the warm, inviting smells of cinnamon, nutmeg, clove, and honey to help soothe the poor half-orc's weary soul, and handed him a cup soon after, a flaming heart adorning the foamy milk on top.
Thanks, Ems. It smells nice.
Not a problem, big guy. Just drink it before you fall asleep with it in your hand,
Emily answered and walked away back towards the machine as Targe gave her a thumbs up, a mug already depositing the warm coffee to his lips. She already knew the smell was going to attract Oggledock towards her any moment now, and made a double portion for the two of them as she looked out the window to Jamaica, who was angrily kicking a melted tire over and over again and screaming something about Yopuya. "You like that thing? Found it in an abandoned museum on one of his high-risk runs." Emily turned, startled, with a percolator in hand, to see Oggledock had ghosted up beside her, his eyes weary as he looked out into the space behind the company building. Oggledock continued, pulling down his own mug from the rack, an ugly-looking thing that looked as if it had been made by a blind kobold with 2 clubs for hands. Said it was the perfect kind of ugly, and had lent it to Targe and Yopuya so they could move around Paradise Valley, since Yopuya doesn't own a vehicle and Targe only has a small Civic.
A Civic?
Emily asked incredulously, putting the percolator into place and turning it with a sharp click.
It's very economical,
Targe called out from the couch, and even Oggledock smirked at the comment. He's probably going to spend thousands on gremlins to get it back into shape, then he's going to turn Targe and Yopuya into throw rugs.
Hey, I did nothing wrong. It was that damn bird woman that cocked up the entire gig.
Targe barked out angrily, turning in his seat to look over at Oggledock. Yopuya stepped out from around the corner of the hallway with a few of the rocks in her wing claws, and she sounded almost sad at the flack she was getting.
But they are pretty. Look, this one looks like a little campfire inside it.
Emily had to admit the childish glee in the harpy's eyes made her smile, but it was the same carefree kind of nature that ended up getting someone killed.
Targe could have gotten hurt, Yoy. What you did was very irresponsible.
Oggledock furrowed his brows and looked up at her with an astonished and angry smile, as if to say, "Are you really going to chastise her?" Emily looked at him back in a way that said, "I will throw this coffee in your face and listen to the sounds your sizzling skin makes." But he just shook his head and quietly chuckled.
No, look. These are definitely worth the risk. Look.
Yopuya crowed and jogged over to Emily, holding the largish common and fire opals up to her face. Emily blew air into the harpy's face to get her back away from her, since both her hands were working the machine.
Oh, quit. You're gonna make me spill. We'll look at your shiny rocks later.
Yopuya giggled and retreated, clicking over and perching on top of the couch arm next to Targe. Emily poured out the measures of dark hazel espresso into Oggledock's mug and the one she plucked from the hanging rack for herself, then poured in the steamed milk, clicking away with her spoon as she spoke. "So how hard were you on Maril?" "Not nearly as hard as I was with you. I think I got the point across, though. She's currently sulking in her room, if I had to imagine," Oggledock murmured, taking the now full mug and dipping his finger into the foam, scooping up a bit and bringing it to his lips.
Speaking of that,
Targe said, scooting away angrily from Yopuya.
How was Vegas?
Emily chewed a bit on her lip as she looked down into her mug, but before she could speak, she heard Maril's hoofs clop down the hallway, and she turned to see the centaur leaning against the hallway entryway. "Well, I'll tell you, Taj, it sure could have gone better," she said bitterly, still smarting from her talking to by Oggledock. "I almost ended up as an entree for fish people. I can still smell someone's brains from inside my cleavage. Emily beat her high score for body count and then put on a magical necklace that talks to her and sets her on fire." Targe looked from Maril to Emily, then back to Yopuya, who had hunched her shoulders and was looking wide-eyed at Maril. The half-orc leaned down towards Yopuya and muttered so just the two of them could hear.
"I'm not mad about our week anymore, I think."
Yopuya looked still wide-eyed at Targe.
"I agree. At least I did not kill someone with my boobs."
She said this a little less quietly than she should have, eliciting a chortle from Oggledock, a groan from Emily, and a book thrown into the back of her head from Maril. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, so much for watching the video. If you liked the video, feel free to comment or subscribe or like the video. That's kind of like the easiest thing you can do there. I would appreciate it. Guardbeardia would appreciate it, puts all this work into it. So that way I can read these wonderful, wonderful stories. Anyway, y'all have a great day. This has been Guardbeardia.